She was 2 years old. She did not yet know her last name. She knew the smell of her mother's coat and the sound of her father's boots on the kitchen floor, and the particular way the afternoon light came through the curtains in her bedroom on Carvel Road, and that was the sum total of the world she had been given time to learn. On the afternoon of October 19th, 1977, Sophie Turner was taken from the front yard of her family's brick colonial in the town of Milford, Delaware, by a woman who had been standing at the edge of that yard for less than 4 minutes. She was wearing a red corduroy jacket. She had a small music box in her coat pocket that played 11 seconds of a lullaby when you wound the key. She was gone before her mother finished the phone call she had stepped inside to take. That is not a story about a toddler who wandered into a street. That is a story about a woman named Nadine Purcell who had done this before, who had in fact been doing versions of this for years, in ways the system was too fragmented to see, and who would raise Sophie Turner as a daughter named Melissa Ann Purcell in a double-wide trailer outside of Smyrna, Delaware, less than 31 miles from the house on Carvel Road. It would take a retired records clerk, a discarded birthday card found in a storage unit, and a genealogy database match processed on a Tuesday afternoon in 2023 to close those 31 miles and those 47 years. But before any of that can mean anything, we have to go back to October. Because the hardest part of this story is not that Sophie was taken. The hardest part is what it means to find someone who has no memory of being lost. Milford, Delaware, in the autumn of 1977, was a small manufacturing and farming town straddling the Kent and Sussex county lines, the kind of place that appeared on maps as a modest dot between Dover and the coast. The Mispillion River cut through the center of town past the old canneries and the grain elevator, and in October the silver maples along Carvel Road dropped their leaves all at once, in a way that residents described as reliable. One strong cold night, and then the whole street was gold. Population was just under 5,000. People drove to the Acme for groceries and to the Methodist Church on Union Street for everything else that mattered. Thomas and Evelyn Turner had been on Carvel Road for 4 years. Thomas managed the receiving dock at a plastics plant on the edge of town, a quiet man with large hands and a methodical nature that his co-workers respected and his family loved. Evelyn had worked as a bank teller before Sophie was born and had taken leave and not yet gone back, partly because of Sophie and partly because of the second pregnancy she was now 6 months into. They were the kind of young couple that older neighbors described as solid, the ones who shoveled your walk without being asked, who brought a casserole when you came home from the hospital, who waved from the driveway in a way that meant it. Sophie was their first. 26 months old in October of 1977, born the previous August during one of the hottest weeks Delaware had seen in a decade. Delivered by a doctor named Rafferty, who had also delivered Evelyn herself 28 years earlier. She had a head of dark curly hair that her mother kept back with small barrettes. Blue ones, usually, because Sophie had strong opinions about color that seemed improbable for a child her age. She had learned to walk at 11 months and had been compensating for lost crawling time ever since, moving through rooms with a purposefulness that made Thomas joke she walked like she had somewhere to be. The music box had been a gift from Evelyn's mother, who lived in Wilmington, and who visited the first Sunday of every month. It played the opening of Brahms' Lullaby, 11 seconds before it needed to be wound again, and Sophie had developed the habit of carrying it in the pocket of whatever jacket she was wearing, which meant it went everywhere with her and was wound and rewound approximately 40 times a day. The spring in the mechanism was beginning to wear. On the morning of October 19th, the silver maples on Carvel Road had finished dropping. The yard was deep in leaves. Thomas was at the plant. Evelyn had brought Sophie outside after lunch to play in the leaf piles, then stepped inside to answer the phone, her mother, calling about the Sunday visit. She was inside for 6 minutes. The phone call log from the Wilmington Exchange would later confirm this precisely. When she came back to the door, the yard was empty. The red corduroy jacket was not in the yard. The music box was not in the yard. Sophie Turner was not in the yard. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Evelyn Turner came out the front door calling her daughter's name. At 2:20, she was at the sidewalk. At 2:24, she was knocking on the neighbor's door to the left and then the door to the right. At 2:30, she called the Milford Police Department from the kitchen telephone, and the dispatcher who answered would later say that the sound of Evelyn Turner's voice was something she carried for the rest of her career. 2 officers arrived on Carvel Road at 2:41. They walked the yard, the side lots, the alley behind the row of houses. They knocked on every door on the block. They found a neighbor, a retired postal worker named Earl Hicks, who spent most afternoons on his front porch, who said he had seen a woman on the sidewalk in front of the Turner house in the early afternoon. He said he'd noticed her because she'd been standing there a while, looking at the yard. He described her as white, middle-aged, maybe 45 or 50, heavy-set, wearing a dark coat. He said she had a car parked a half block up, a sedan, brown or tan, older model. He had not seen her take anything. He had looked away when his wife called him in for something, and when he looked back, the woman was gone. No other witnesses placed anyone unusual on Carvel Road that afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the Milford police had requested assistance from the Delaware State Police. By 7, a search team was covering the parks and the riverbank and the rail yard on the south end of town. A canine unit was brought from Dover. The dog followed a scent from the front yard to the sidewalk, up the block to where Earl Hicks had described the parked car, and stopped. There was nothing at that spot. No fibers, no footprint, no cigarette end, just a patch of October curb where something had happened and left nothing behind. Thomas Turner arrived home from the plant at 6:15 to find 3 police cars in front of his house. He stood in the driveway for a moment before he went inside. His co-workers, who would speak about him later, said he was never quite the same person after that night. The lead detective assigned to the Turner case was a state police investigator named Bernard Watts, 47 years old, based in Dover, 22 years on the job. He was known in the department for 2 things: a preternatural patience with witnesses who needed time to remember, and a habit of re-interviewing people weeks after the initial canvass, on the theory that what people couldn't tell you the first day, they sometimes could tell you the 3rd week. Watts began building a list of women who had come to the attention of Delaware Social Services or law enforcement in cases involving children, specifically women with histories of attachment disorders or prior incidents of taking other people's children. A narrow and poorly tracked category in 1977, when the national missing children infrastructure was still 3 years away from its first major legislation. 2 names surfaced within the first month. One was a woman in Seaford who had a documented incident in 1971 involving a neighbor's child, adjudicated as a misunderstanding, records sealed. She had moved to Pennsylvania in 1975, and her alibi for October 19th was her employer. The second name was a woman named Nadine Purcell, 44 years old, residing in a rental property outside Smyrna. Purcell had a 1969 incident on her record, an attempted removal of a child from a playground in Lewes that had been witnessed and stopped. Charged as disorderly conduct, resolved with a fine. She had no children of her own. She drove a 1972 Buick LeSabre tan. Watts drove to Smyrna and knocked on Nadine Purcell's door on November 8, 1977, 20 days after Sophie Turner disappeared. Purcell answered the door alone. She was cooperative. She said she had been home on October 19th and had not left Smyrna. She had no corroborating witness. Her car, parked in the gravel drive, matched Earl Hicks' description precisely. Watts noted all of this in his report. He requested a warrant to search the property. The warrant was denied. The judge who reviewed the application determined that a car description and an old, unrelated incident did not constitute probable cause. He was not wrong, under the law as it stood. Watts drove back to Dover. He wrote in his report, "Purcell requires monitoring. Insufficient grounds at this time." He monitored. Twice more he drove to Smyrna in the following 6 months. Purcell was always there. She was always cooperative. And she was always alone. Thomas and Evelyn Turner's second child, a boy they named Daniel, was born in January of 1978. Evelyn said later that she held him for the first hour after delivery without speaking, that she kept looking at the door, that she could not stop thinking that Sophie did not know she had a brother. By 1983, 6 years had passed. Watts had transferred to a different unit and then retired early on a medical leave that became permanent. The Turner case had been handed to a new investigator who worked it for 2 years and then was reassigned. By the time Sophie would have been starting 2nd grade, the active investigation had effectively ended, though the file remained open in name. Thomas Turner had begun driving the roads between Milford and Smyrna on weekends. Not every weekend, but enough that Evelyn knew where he went when he left on Saturday mornings, without saying much. He drove slowly. He looked at yards. He looked at children. He did not find his daughter, but he could not stop looking in the places the warrant had never let anyone officially look. By 1990, 13 years gone, Daniel Turner was 12 and had grown up knowing he had a sister somewhere. Evelyn had kept Sophie's room, the blue barrettes still on the dresser, the curtains the same. She did not talk about it often. When she did, she used the present tense. Sophie is. Sophie has. Not Sophie was. By 1997, 20 years, Thomas had a heart condition now and had retired from the plant. He and Evelyn had joined a national network for families of missing children that had been established in the mid-'80s, one of the organizations that emerged from the legislative push after Adam Walsh's murder made the country confront what it had not been tracking. They submitted Sophie's information. They sent photographs, the most recent being from October of 1977, the red corduroy jacket, the dark curly hair, to every database that would take them. By 2005, Nadine Purcell had died. She passed in a Smyrna hospital in February of that year, listed as having no surviving family. The double wide on the county road had been cleaned out by a property management company and the contents sent to storage. Thomas Turner died in 2011. He had never stopped driving those roads. Evelyn Turner, 81 years old, still lived on Carvel Road. The blue barrettes were still on the dresser. This channel exists to find the cases that didn't end when the file went cold. If this story matters to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's the only way we can keep doing this work. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's get back to Milford. In the spring of 2022, a property management company in Kent County was clearing out a storage unit that had gone unpaid since 2019. The unit had originally been rented in 2005, the same year Nadine Purcell died, by a woman who paid 3 years of fees in advance and then, apparently, forgot about it, or did not survive long enough to retrieve it. Among the contents, furniture, boxes of papers, several bags of clothing, and a plastic bin of what appeared to be keepsakes. A records clerk named Donna Sherwood, working for the company, was tasked with sorting for items of value before disposal. In the plastic bin she found, among other things, A small music box with a worn key mechanism and a birthday card, handmade, the kind a child makes in grade school, crayon and construction paper, addressed to Mommy and signed, in unsteady letters, Melissa. Sherwood had worked in records long enough to know what storage units from dead estates sometimes contained. She had also, 20 years earlier, worked briefly for the Delaware Department of Children, Youth and Families, and she had a habit of mind that comes from years of filing things and noticing when they don't quite fit. The music box struck her as wrong for a woman Purcell's age. Too old. Too worn in the specific way that a child's toy gets worn. She did not throw it away. She took photographs of the music box and the birthday card, and, on an instinct she would later describe simply as something feeling off, she submitted the photographs to the Delaware State Police tip line. The tip sat in a queue for 4 months. In October of 2022, a cold case detective named Renata Okafor, 38 years old, 6 years in the unit, pulled the submission as part of a routine queue review. She looked at the music box photograph. She cross-referenced it against the 1977 Turner case file, which she had read during a training exercise 2 years earlier because it was used as an example of an under-resourced early investigation. The Turner file noted, in the original evidence list, victim was believed to have been carrying a small music box. Approximate description: metal, key wound, lullaby melody. Not recovered. Okafor pulled Purcell's old file. She read Watts's 1977 report. She read his note: Purcell requires monitoring. She drove to the storage facility. The music box was still there. The worn key mechanism was swabbed. Biological material was recovered from the inside of the key housing, the residue of 47 years of small fingers winding and rewinding a spring. It was submitted to the State Forensic Laboratory in November of 2022. The genealogy analysis took 5 months. On a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2023, Okafor received a call from the laboratory. The DNA from the music box key matched a living individual in a genealogy database. The match was not partial. It was direct. The individual's name in the database was Melissa Purcell. Melissa Ann Purcell was 49 years old. She lived in Hagerstown, Maryland. She was a licensed practical nurse with 17 years at the same hospital. She was divorced, with 2 adult sons. She had registered with an ancestry database 2 years earlier, casually, on the suggestion of a coworker who was building a family tree, and had not thought much about it since. What she had thought about, periodically, her whole adult life, was the fact that she had no documentation of her existence before age 4. No birth certificate that anyone had been able to fully verify. No baby photographs. No record of any hospital in Delaware that matched the birth story her mother had given her. She had asked Nadine about this twice, once as a teenager and once in her 20s, and both times Nadine had produced an explanation that was technically sufficient and emotionally evasive, and that Melissa had accepted the way children accept things that are easier to accept than to pursue. She had a recurring thing that was not quite a memory and not quite a feeling, more like a texture. The sound of a particular kind of silence, the sense of having been, once, in a yard in autumn. She did not know what it meant. She had never known what it meant. Detective Okafor drove to Hagerstown on a Thursday morning in April of 2023. She had called ahead. She had been careful about what she said on the phone, enough to ensure Melissa would agree to a meeting, not enough to cause harm, before she could be present. They sat at Melissa's kitchen table. Okafor put the photograph of the music box on the table between them. Melissa looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get that?" she said. Not a question. A very quiet statement. "We found it in a storage unit in Kent County," Okafor said. Miss Purcell, I need to tell you something, and I want to be here with you when you hear it. The Dina from the music box key confirmed what Bernard Watts had written in a notebook in November of 1977, and what a Kent County judge had declined to act on. Nadine Purcell had taken Sophie Turner from her front yard on Carvel Road. She had driven 31 miles and raised her as her own. Purcell had been dead for 18 years by the time the confirmation came. There would be no arrest. There would be no sentencing hearing. There would be no moment when the community gathered to watch justice be administered to a face. That is one of the specific griefs of a case like this one, and it deserves to be named. What there was instead, a Thursday afternoon in May of 2023, when Okafor drove from Milford to Hagerstown to bring Melissa Turner, she had begun, carefully and with professional support, to use that name alongside the one she had always known, to the house on Carvel Road for the first time since she was 2 years old, and had no capacity to remember leaving it. Evelyn Turner was 81 years old. She had been told, as gently as Okafor knew how to do it, over several phone calls and one in-person visit, what was coming. She had cried in a way that her son Daniel, who sat beside her, said he had never heard from her in 50 years of watching her hold herself together. On a Thursday afternoon in May, a woman named Melissa, who was also named Sophie, stood at the end of Carvel Road and looked at a brick colonial with a front yard and silver maple trees that had been dropping leaves on the same schedule since before she was born. She did not remember it. She had said this to Okafor more than once in the weeks of preparation, that she was afraid of going somewhere she was supposed to remember and feeling nothing, that she did not want to perform recognition she didn't have, that she wasn't sure she knew how to be someone's daughter again when she had never known she was anyone's daughter in the first place. Okafor had told her she didn't have to feel anything in particular. She just had to show up. The feeling would be whatever it was. The front door opened before she reached the porch. Evelyn Turner stood in the doorway, 81 years old, the same woman who had stepped inside to answer a phone call in October of 1977, and she looked at the dark curly hair, gone gray now at the temples, and the particular way this woman stood, with a purposefulness that looked like she had somewhere to be. Evelyn said one word. She said it the way you say a word you've been holding in your chest for 47 years. She said, Sophie. The Turner case has prompted the Delaware State Police Cold Case Unit to formally review 43 open cases from the 1970s involving child disappearances, where a suspect was identified but a warrant was denied at the time, due to insufficient probable cause. Detective Okafor has testified before the state legislature on the gap between what investigators knew in 1977 and what legal standards allowed them to act on. Donna Sherwood, the records clerk who photographed the music box, was recognized by the Delaware Attorney General's office in August of 2023. She said at the ceremony that she didn't do anything special. She said she just couldn't make herself throw it away. Daniel Turner, who grew up knowing he had a sister somewhere, drove from his home in Newark to Milford the day after the reunion. He sat with his mother and his sister at the kitchen table on Carvel Road, and they talked for 4 hours. He said afterward that Sophie laughed like their father. He said he hadn't been expecting that. He said it was the best thing he had ever heard. Melissa, Sophie, is continuing her work as a nurse in Hagerstown. She is also, with the support of her own family and the help she needs to do this carefully, spending time on Carvel Road. Learning a history she was never given, holding barrettes that were kept for her on a dresser for 47 years. Sophie Turner was 2 years old. She did not yet know her last name. She knew the smell of her mother's coat and the sound of her father's boots on the floor, and then those things were taken from her before she was old enough to hold on to them. What the people who loved her understood What Evelyn Turner understood every day for 47 years on Carville Road, and what Thomas understood every Saturday morning on those slow drives between Milford and Smyrna, is that a child does not have to remember being loved in order to have been loved. The love doesn't require the memory, it only requires the staying. A few questions before you go. Nadine Purcell died in 2005, 18 years before the confirmation came. Does a case like this feel resolved to you without a trial, without a verdict, without any moment of public accountability? What strikes you most about Bernard Watt's 1977 report? The fact that he named the right person in the right month and couldn't act on it? Or the fact that he wrote down Purcell requires monitoring as if he knew someday someone would read it? And what does it mean for Melissa, for Sophie, to discover, at 49 years old, that the life she thought she knew had a different beginning? How do you hold two true stories of yourself at the same time? Justice for Sophie Turner arrived 47 years late and without a courtroom. But the music box is back on Carville Road now, and the blue barrettes are no longer waiting on an empty dresser. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes or how incomplete the ending, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.